Okay, so thanks very much for your kind introductions. And as you said, this will be a joint presentation between me and Ian. Ian, do you want to just say hello?
Everyone, good evening.
And the title of the presentation was, oh, it seems to be automatically going. Sorry, Gary. There we go. We go back. The title of the presentation was Healthy Psychosocial Development of Elite Youth Athletes. Now, why are we actually talking about this topic? It's because talent development is often perceived as risky. I was just looking in the chat and I saw quite a few comments around this idea of maybe athletes being seen as commodities and perhaps not putting their experience first. Now, where does that come from, that idea of talent development as risky? Well, it comes from the idea that we're dealing with young people, and young people are going through a series of psychosocial developmental stages, and they face a number of challenges as they're growing up. In particular, the types of athletes we deal with when we're thinking about talented athletes often are developing a sense of independence from their parents, developing their own identity, seeking out a future career, and establishing a stable kind of self-image. But we also have typical talent development system features, and they're often described as maybe quite restrictive, quite adult-focused, quite scrutinizing, performance-driven, and perhaps requesting or demanding quite a lot of sacrifice from those young people. And as a result, we think that that might put young people at risk, in particular for burnout, for not developing a very well-rounded identity, for perhaps sacking off their education, or just generally compromising their well-being. But me and Ian also want to make the case, and thankfully someone else already made this for me earlier in the conference, that we could take an alternative perspective, that actually talent development environments maybe aren't that different to grassroots youth sport participation, that they offer many of the same opportunities for really meaningful social interaction, for the development of useful psychosocial and interpersonal skills, and that they can be almost like a training ground for life. Like Kev said, actually, we might even argue that because of the fact that we're moving to a higher quality environment with perhaps more intensive engagement and therefore maybe more opportunities for some of those benefits, with highly qualified coaches, really good facilities and lots of resources for support, that actually this kind of environment would offer almost youth sport plus, right? Something with added benefits. And actually those two lines of reasoning that I've just outlined are what you probably typically would see in the literature. On the one side, we've got people who we would describe as sports cynics, people who tend to go elite sport is wholly bad and there's not much good about it or in it for young people. And on the other side, we might have sport evangelists, and they often sit maybe more in the participation sport domain, where we believe that sport can do a whole lot of good. But like Kev already highlighted in his opening session, is, earlier session, that when we look at that literature and when we review both bodies of literature, so the grassroots literature and then the literature associated with more intensive sport participation, we can see that there's actually a potential for a wide range of positive and negative physical and psychosocial impacts that fall out of this kind of engagement. Now, me and Ian are arguing that we probably therefore need to start studying this actually, because the previous literature is cherry picking from bits of research that are out there. And they often focus on only one aspect, on only one risk or only one benefit, but they don't tend to focus on elite youth sport context or talent development context, and they tend to not measure all of those things together. So we're going to talk you through the results from two case studies. One of the case studies is a study that I conducted with a Category 1 elite youth soccer academy in the UK, very much focused on producing the next top players for the Premier League, but with an ethos that was also about providing really worthwhile experiences and developing the players holistically. What we did was we followed a group of under 12s to under 16s over the course of a year. And we measured a number of well-being and psychosocial development indicators, as well as their grades. Sorry, I have no idea why it's doing that. As well as their grades. We interviewed them about their experiences. And we also interviewed a number of players that were part of that environment between 1 and 10 years ago. Ian.
Yeah, and the second case study that I'll talk to you about is that of an intensive wrestling camp in the United States of America aimed at high school wrestlers. So we're looking at kind of ages 14 to 18. And whilst most of the kids that sign up to that camp would say they're going to develop wrestling skills, the camp director was pretty clear in discussions with us that one of his primary focuses really is development of mental skills and life skills to help them function as better individuals in school and the rest of their life as well. And so over that 2-week camp, we did questionnaires at the beginning and the end, and at 6-month follow-up with a larger sample with over half of the participants at camp. And then we had a smaller sample of approximately 10 that we interviewed and observed for the duration of the camp as well. Fieke.
Okay, so if we go back to the findings from the Soccer Academy study, that makes very clear to us that, and I have to kind of say at the start, that the dominant findings from this place were pretty positive around the psychosocial health and well-being and development of the young players. But it also is nuanced. If we initially go to the concern of those players perhaps being overly burdened by the environment, we showed that actually over the course of the year, their levels of stress were not very high and reduced, and their levels of recovery were pretty good and actually increased over time. So their rest recovery balance was pretty good. Equally, when we asked them about their psychological well-being over the course of the year, they reported that to be stable, positive, and completely within the European norms for children of their age. We also asked them about their basic psychological needs, so that they feel they had any kind of autonomy, that they feel related, and that they feel that they had a sense of competence. And actually, those needs were often satisfied and stable across the year, and rarely dissatisfied, and that was stable across the year. But when we then look at the qualitative data, we can see that some of those players, or actually most of those players, did perceive a sense of pressure. Many of them described this feeling of always being watched, always being assessed, always having to live up to particular expectations. But what those players highlighted was that some of them thrived under that pressure, whereas others perhaps struggled more. And that shows us that maybe the experience of players and the impact on players is not universal, but it's quite individual. Then the data also showed us that impact is not stable and it's emerging. So if we think about the kind of psychosocial skills that players thought they developed, most of them said, I learned lots of stuff on the pitch, but actually, maybe I actually even learned more off the pitch. I learned about work ethic, I learned about dedication, I learned about my time management, I learned about being independent, I learned about managing myself. And what players admitted is that those kind of skills, often they kind of realized they had them when they became useful in other contexts, so like school or when they went to university. When we then look at education and our concern that those kind of players are perhaps prioritizing sport too much, they filled in the athletic identity measurement scale. And it showed that they have a very strong and pretty exclusive athletic identity, much higher than their peers, their age group peers. But at the same time, whilst it is a risk factor for things like sacking off education, their grades didn't show any negative impact compared to, again, other age group peers that weren't in the academy. But qualitatively, the players did admit that they probably were quite tempted to put all their eggs in one basket, not to listen to coaches and kind of let those messages around needing a backup plan initially fall on deaf ears. But when we then look at the accounts of players that were in the academy 1 to 10 years ago, retrospectively, they all said it hadn't had a negative impact on their education, and actually had it opened doors for them that maybe would have stayed closed otherwise. So for example, they would have got scholarships in the UK or abroad, or they would have developed an attitude and a set of skills that allowed them to go to university, which was probably something they never really aspired to do in the first place. So to conclude, we don't think talent development and its environments are good or bad. They can be both. We believe that impact is not something that is simply understood. It's not stable, it's not universal, and it really does require a more integrated and more nuanced understanding. But we do believe it's within your control as practitioners, as coaches, as organizations to tip the scale towards the positive. And if we're accepting these environments are here to stay, and there will be selective environments, then perhaps we should focus on making the best out of them for all of the participants, not for the very few that make it. That requires attention for what your context is aiming to achieve, how best to align your practice to this, to plan for it deliberately, and is very much driven by recruiting probably the right people to do that job. Thank you very much for listening to us.